Hello, everyone. How's it going? Hope you're enjoying this fine Tuesday afternoon. I'm your host, Divonis. Welcome back to my podcast, Trip Sitting, where I just go over, basic life, music, mycology, and everything in between. Today, I actually have a singularity. I say singularity. I have a singular topic that I want to speak about today, and that is how to get into mycology on a budget. If you're like me, you're probably from a background where you don't have any former experience in mycology. Like there's no one in your family that's doing it. There's no one that's teaching it. So you're just kind of going in full throttle head first into all the new subjects. And it can be it can be very intimidating at the beginning to have to be like, oh, I need a flow laminar hood, which can go anywhere from a few hundred to a few $1,000s. I need a pressure cooker. I need a dehydrator. I need stable conditions, all that. If we can get to all that stuff, and I can show you from my personal experience what I've been doing with on a budget. So let's start with flow laminar hoods. Do you need a flow laminar hood? No, you do not need a flow laminar hood. The reason why is because you can create your own low cost steel airbox, which basically is a substitute for a laminar hood. Of course, if you want to go into mycology as a profession, you want to have the highest rate of success. Having a flow laminar hood would be the best choice for you, just because it offers that 99.9% purified air being blown constantly, so that you don't have to worry about contaminants while you're inoculating or putting spores to agar or whatever you're trying to do, right? So having a flow laminar hood would be the most beneficial thing, but like I said, they can be very, very costly. So finding a decently sized plastic tote that's clear. Let's make sure it's clear. You want to see what you're doing. You're going to get a plastic tote. You want to drill some holes into it that are big enough to where you can stick your hands through it. And you can get all fancy and put the tape and the gloves and all that through it. You don't really need to do all that. You just need to get a basic plastic container that's big enough to hold whatever whatever grain you're going to be inoculating. Because you basically only use steel air boxes for a few reasons. If you're trying to inoculate grain, if you're trying to put some culture into agar, or that's really it for what I know. Obviously, I'm still new to this. Only been doing it for a few months now. So if anyone else has any other methods that you use a steel air box for, please let me know. Also, another thing that I really, really, really want to emphasize is being sterile. Being sterile is probably the most important part of this whole hobby. And now I know a lot of people who are getting into mycology. You may ask yourself, well, mushrooms grow naturally on poop and shit all over the world. Why do I have to be sterile whenever I'm trying to cultivate them inside of a controlled environment? Well, the main reason for that is just because outside they're competing with other species, of course, but it's on a more even playing field. Everyone has the same things such as rain to compete against, the air, the temperature, things of that nature. However, whenever you're inside, the only thing that's competing with your mycelium is probably, the mold that you have that's going around. Cottonwood mold is a really big contaminant for mycology. I actually experienced some cottonwood mold whenever I was trying to inoculate some jars a few weeks ago, so I can give you firsthand experience that it's pretty prevalent. So yeah, that's why you have to be super sterile, because contaminants will have no matter what, no matter how long you try to do this, eventually at some point in your mycology journey, you will experience some contaminants, and it's not the end of the world. You can just, if you already have more spores you can inoculate with, you can just learn from your mistakes, become more. Sorry, someone's calling me. Sorry about that interruption. My girlfriend was calling me. Anyways, if you have more spores that you can inoculate with those, it's not the end of the world. But if you don't, then there are reputable places online to where you can look them up. I'm not going to recommend any places online just because, validity of websites can differ depending on what year it is, what day it is, So I can't give you any suggestions. I would just suggest going to the Shroomery on Reddit or something like that, going online. There's a bunch of forums about it. Or even if you think you're good enough at identification in the wild, I would say you can see if you can find some species of cubensis, pinalius. There's a bunch of species that grow nationwide, and I'm speaking specifically for America because I don't know the rest of the world, like how their mushroom species differ. Like I know some places can grow flyaric, however you say it. You know, Amanita muscaria, the mushrooms that you see on Mario all the time, those type of mushrooms. So yeah, I don't know the other regions. So anyways, getting back on topic. So that's what I would say about contamination. So another topic that I want to speak on today is shoe boxes versus monotubs. How big of the flushes do you want to have? And at the beginning, you may not even have enough grain spawn to even produce a monotub. So I would just suggest for anyone who's starting, just get like 2 or 3 shoe boxes, and they can be. I'm sorry, I'm not like amazing with measurements. So if you guys are looking for measurements online, I'm sorry, I can't provide that for you. I just know what I got. I don't even know what size they are. I just eyeball. I really just eyeball everything. Everything's about filling. So I got about 2 or 3 shoe boxes. I need to get more, honestly, because my production's kind of getting rapid at this point. But yeah, I would suggest getting shoe boxes to start off with, just so you can do like a few test runs to see how good are these genetics with these spores. How good is this substrate with these spores? With these genetics, because substrate and stuff matters. But I'm gonna get more into substrate in a little bit on this podcast. But yeah, I would recommend getting shoe boxes if you're starting out. But highly, highly, highly recommend starting to get monotubs once you actually get a grounding into these things, because obviously the more fruits you produce, the higher quantity in which you can do whatever you want with them. Like I said, I'm not gonna advocate for any consumption, cultivation, or distribution of any illegal substances. Make sure you check your local jurisdiction and see the laws pertaining around psilocybin and things of that nature. But anyways, yeah, I would suggest shoe boxes for beginners and then go into monotubs whenever you think that your production is at that level. Now, moving forward from there, another topic is making your own substrate versus buying in bulk. And honestly, I would strongly recommend if you're starting out to just buy bulk substrate. Because the whole process of knowing how to pasteurize your own substrate, sterilize it, make sure it's good for use, field capacity, all that stuff, that's something that isn't necessarily difficult, but at the same time, it's whenever you're first starting into mycology and obviously working on a budget, you can't necessarily, not everyone has like a pressure cooker that they can just use to sterilize or pasteurize their substrate. And pasteurization is pretty good if you're doing like outside growing, but it's not necessarily the greatest if you're trying to do indoor grows, just because pasteurization doesn't necessarily kill all of the contaminants. Like there is still a bunch of contaminants that could survive the pasteurization option, whereas when you sterilize them, it's like a very big chance that all of the contaminants inside of your substrate will be killed. So yeah, I would just recommend buying your own bulk substrate and then eventually learning how to do your own substrate, because you're going to have to learn how to do it eventually. I just feel like it would be super beneficial to learn. I recommend just getting cocoa coir. Most mushrooms love cocoa coir, and just getting some vermiculite and learning how to do mixtures of those two, so you can get like proper balances of the cocoa coir to vermiculite. And some people use coffee. I don't really know how coffee works, so I can't really give you my opinion about that, but I know some people like using coffee. But I would just recommend using cocoa coir and vermiculite. I feel like that would just be the best starter friendly way of making your own substrate. But if you don't feel like you're qualified to do that, just buy it in bulk. Just places like North Spore that sell it really cheap, well, relatively cheap. I got a value pack that came with their max yield tub, that came with inoculation bag jar with rye berries, and like it came with like 2 or 3 bulk substrates 2 or 3 bricks of bulk substrate. So yeah, that's my little opinion on that. And now moving on to spore prints, cultures, agars, syringes. Which one should you get? Which one should you get into? What's the most practical for starting out on a budget? And I will honestly say syringes is probably the best way to go in terms of like the most readily accessible ways of getting genetics. Because like in most places besides like California and a few other states in America, you can actually legally buy spores online, because spores don't actually contain psilocybin themselves. It's the fruits that they produce that contain the psilocybin. So having the spores themselves is not illegal. So you can actually purchase them online. So I would recommend getting syringes because that's what I find the most readily available. But if you want to get into mycology, like seriously, I would recommend learning how to do prints, cultures, and especially like cultures and agar. Like cultures and agar is probably the most beneficial thing you can learn in mycology. Because having a culture or a library would make you have an infinite amount of possibilities and like infinite amount of potential yields that you can do versus just having a spore syringe that only lasts like probably, depending on what you're using. Like I use the broke boy tech that Philly Golden Teacher teaches. So I use brown rice and mason jars. So, that actually lasted me a few mason jars. Like having one syringe lasted me a few mason jars. But if you're doing like inoculating a bag of rye berries that are pre-made or like a more larger things like PF tech, you might need to probably invest in some culture at agar because it will just exponentially increase the process and speed in which those things are cultivated. Like let's give for an example. If you are doing the broke boy tech like me and you inoculate it with agar, it'll probably take about, a week or so to actually fully colonize. Like I wouldn't even say a week or so. I would say it probably takes like 2 or 3 days until you have to shake it because, you have to shake it to distribute the mycelium. But if you're to do a spore syringe, it'll probably take you like 2 weeks just to get to the point where you can even shake it. Whereas agar, like I said, is super fast. Having a liquid culture is also super fast because, you already have the mycelium like developed. It's just like you have to put it onto food for it to eat and like be able to colonize. So that's why I would say cultures and like agar is a lot faster than syringes. But obviously, we're talking about beginning into mycology. And I think that spore prints and syringes is probably the easiest way to do it. And making your own spore print is actually super, super easy. You just get like any cap of a mushroom that you already have. This will require you to already either have a specimen grown or just you bought a specimen that was already alive. That's not dead yet. Make sure it's not like dried out because if it's dried out, it cannot produce spores anymore. So make sure that it either hasn't sporulated yet or is on the process of sporulating. So you take the cap of the mushroom and you just put it on either some tin foil or paper and you can even put it on a piece of glass and I would put it in a still air box just to minimize the amount of wind and like moisture and stuff that is getting in contact with it because spore prints are pretty fragile, so you have to make sure that you don't get any extra wind or water on it because it could possibly rub the spore print off. So yeah, that's just my little tip on spore prints and like difference between spore prints, cultures, agar, syringes, which one's best for beginners. Like I said, I think syringes and prints are the best. And after you wait a little bit, you see your jars are starting to become colonized. You think they're fully colonized. You think it's ready to put into substrate, and you already have some bulk substrate that you bought. You're already basically most of the way there. All you have to do is just combine them. So what I like to do is I like to do a 1-to-2 ratio. So for every like jar of spawn that I have, I like to do 2 servings of substrate. And this is relative. A lot of people just say you can eyeball it, which I also believe you can just eyeball it. But just know like the servings that you need. Because like I said, I'm using shoeboxes and I think shoeboxes are the best for beginners. So shoeboxes need less substrate to spawn than, a monotub may need. Because maybe you need a 2-to-2 ratio if it's a monotub. So, you just have to, it just all depends on what method of cultivation you're using. But I'm going to speak specifically for shoeboxes, and I like to use a 1-to-2 ratio just because I can get that pseudo casing layer at the top, which I consider the 2 of the 1-to-2. So the 1 would be having the spawn and substrate and mixing it together, and then having another casing layer on top of it. That's why I would consider a 2-to-1 ratio. Some people would consider a 2-to-1 ratio having 2 times as much substrate as you do grain spawn, which can also work. That's also a pretty beneficial way of doing it. You can get a lot more fruits that way. It would just probably take a little bit longer to cultivate than if you just to do it the way I was saying it. But obviously, that would also determine the size of your fruits, the size of your yields. Because if you have less substrate, that's like less food for them to eat. So you probably have smaller fruits. and things of that nature. So once you get to that part and you wait about a week, 2 weeks, depending on your conditions, how hot or cold it is in your room or whatever you're doing it in, and the genetics of your spores, how fast or aggressive they are with the colonizing, if they're rhizomorphic, all those different factors. Once you get to a decent enough surface conditions so where you see like your whole substrate is colonized, like it looks like one big white Oreo filling. That's just the best way I can say it. That's what everyone says when they see it whenever it's in my room. But yeah, if you have one big bulk of that and you see little beads of water on top of it, that indicates that it's properly moisturized and it's properly colonized. And that's when you can begin fruiting conditions. Well, what I like to do is whenever I introduce fruiting conditions, I like to have high humidity and high fresh air exchange, because fresh air exchange is very important for growing mushrooms, because mushrooms produce a lot of CO2. So like if they have too much CO2 inside their environment, they're going to start to suffocate and they need oxygen. They're just like us. They need oxygen to breathe. So I'm sorry, guys. I keep underestimating how long this episode's going to be, and my program is keep saying you're running out of space. So give me like 2 seconds. All right, guys, back. It took like less than 2 seconds for y'all, but it took me a little bit longer than 2 seconds. But anyways, so once you get to those surface conditions, that's when you can start the fruiting conditions. And I believe that, like I said, if you have full colonization and water beads, then that's the perfect way to start it. Since I have shoeboxes that don't have the little gap, like they kind of seal off, what I like to do is just to start fruiting conditions, I have this monotub, right? It's called the Maxio monotub. I put 2 to 4 shoeboxes inside of this monotub because that's how much it can fit. Then I only put the lid on, like I don't put the lid on all the way, like I don't tighten. I just put it on top of it to like it can capture the moisture, but also get some passive fresh air exchange so that my mushrooms are getting the proper oxygen that it needs. And also this max yield bin has like these little holes at the top of it. I think there's about 8 or 9 of them, and I have like micropore tape on it as well as like little filters on it just to make sure it's filtering all the bad stuff in the air and only getting like the freshest air it can possibly get. And obviously this little max yield bin is like $100, so like maybe not everyone has a max yield bin like that, so I would recommend just getting another plastic container, a pretty sizable plastic container that you can fit a few shoeboxes in, and just putting the lid on top of that and just putting your shoeboxes inside of that, because it will keep in all the moisture as well as making sure not too much air is getting, because you want air, but at the same time you want to fan it. You don't want to just have constant fresh air exchange. I mean, you can do that, but it just depends on how clean your room is. And I live in a college dorm, so I don't really trust the validity of the filtering of the air, so I just like to be extra careful with that because I want to reduce contams. So that's how I would say surface conditions are met. And finally, my very last tip in mycology. This is for anyone, intermediate, expert, beginner. Be patient. Mushrooms are creatures that respond to a bunch of stimuli, and everyone has their own unique stimuli and conditions in their room. Like some people have hotter rooms than others. Some people have colder rooms. Some people have multiple fans running. Some people have no fans running, like me. I don't have any fans. My room just stays really cold all the time because college dorms just be cold sometimes. But yeah, I would say just be patient, because you will get your fruits. Like they grow in nature all the time, off of terrible conditions, but they can make it work. All you're doing is giving them the most beneficial methods of producing fruits. So just make sure you're doing that, being patient, practicing all the sterile techniques I was saying. Make sure you're using alcohol, wiping down all your surfaces, making sure you sterilize your needles before you inoculate, all of those things. And if you want me to go more into depth, like of each of these subjects, like literally go like 20, 30 minutes just speaking about specifically each of these topics, just let me know because I can. Because right now, these few starter episodes are just my introduction into the whole explaining information in a podcast format. But if you guys want me to go more into depth, I definitely can. But yeah, like I said, just be patient. Your fruits will come. And, I feel like this is a very beautiful hobby or like profession to get into right now, just because we're getting more and more knowledge of it every single day. There are more and more people who are getting into the hobby. Mycology itself is low-key one of those more feared and like less respected fields of medicine, fields of study. I say medicines because, I feel like you can use mushrooms like reishi and lion's mane for medicinal purposes. So that's why I say medicine. But like, this is just one of those fields that are just the most neglected because people don't understand it the most. Mushrooms are only here for like 3 or 4 days, where you can see the same tree for like your whole entire like 60 years of living in one house just because of its nature. But mycelium is around us all the time, everywhere. Most of the time, you're walking around fields, you may not even know that you're stepping in mycelium. And it's okay because they actually like being disrupted like that. Mycelium likes to be around humans because humans pick mushrooms. And like, if people pick mushrooms, there's a greater chance for its spores to be distributed around a greater area. So they actually love being around humans because the mycelium is the tree of the whole organism, and the mushroom is like the apple of the tree. So they don't care if you take a few of their apples, because at the end of the day, you're just extending their life cycle, and you're just extending their lineage and genetic makeup. So yeah, just be patient. Love mycology. I love it. I study it every day. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you in the next one. It's been your host, Divonis.